Hello YouTube, I'm Scruffy at Scruffy Tales, and this is the War Zone. So, a couple of days ago, History of Everything, a fellow YouTuber, gave me a shout out, and that directed a lot of people to my channel. And considering that he has a long series of videos detailing how the Russian Navy messes up all the time, uh, I figured since a lot of his viewers came over here, I will make a video about a massive battle between the Swedish and Russian navies that included between 500 and 600 vessels. So you might say that this video is me welcoming all the new viewers from History of Everything. History of Everything has an awesome channel, by the way, so if you haven't watched his stuff yet, go over and do it. I will leave a link below. So, for everyone who enjoys watching a video about naval warfare and videos where Russia gets its ass kicked, welcome to the video about the Second Battle of Svenskund and the clashes and engagements leading up to this extremely epic battle. In 1721, the Great Northern War ended with the death of the Swedish warrior king Karl XII, also known as Carolus Rex. Sweden had lost its century-long dominant position as one of Europe's absolute military superpowers. And its enemies closed in and cut away what they wanted from Sweden's most far-reaching territories. What followed was a period when Sweden was vulnerable to all its enemies, and Russian troops even made camp outside of Stockholm to ensure that Russian-friendly policies were implemented and respected. In 1788, Swedish King Gustav III decided it was time to end this humiliating period of shame and reclaim Sweden's former glory. A campaign was to be launched to, with military might, retake lost territory in the east from Russia. And the timing was right, as Russia was currently involved in a war with the Turks, and its main forces were distracted in the south. There was only one problem. The Swedish government didn't want to start a war with Russia. The king had to forge a message from his ambassadors in Russia that Russia was planning an attack, despite the war being waged with the Turks. The government fell for the trick and gave permission to the king to assemble both the navy and the army to deal a preemptive strike against the Russians. Said and done, the king gathered his army and navy and set sail for Österland, Swedish for Eastland, the Swedish name for the province that today is better known as the country of Finland. The plan was simple enough. Attack the Russian capital of St. Petersburg from two sides. The main force would march from the north, and the second army would cross the sea and attack from the south. The king and his army was in Helsingfors, today the Finnish capital of Helsinki, when he received news that Swedish troops had attacked a Russian fort in response to a made-up incident where Russian Cossacks were accused of having broken the peace. Gustav III sent word to the Russian Empress Catherine the Great that the two nations now were at war. The situation was not ideal for the Russian Empress, with her capital located in St. Petersburg, right on the border with the Swedes. In fact, St. Petersburg had been the cause of the Great Northern War at the start of the century. Russia had wanted a port that could trade with the West all year around, that would not freeze up during winter. The obvious location had been the Swedish fortress of Svenskund. While the Great Northern War quickly escalated into something much grander in scale, the core of the conflict remained about who would control Svenskund and the ability to utilize the surrounding shores for trade. When the Great Northern War was over, the Russians, having secured the territory surrounding Svenskund, built the great city of St. Petersburg on top of the old fortress. And if Sweden declared war on Russia, the Russians knew that it could only mean one thing. Sweden intended to conquer, or at the very least occupy, St. Petersburg. Both the Swedes and the Russians knew that the war could be over before it had begun, depending on who gained control over the body of water that is today known as the Gulf of Finland. If Russia could defeat the Swedish Navy, then the Swedish army would have problems being supplied and could not launch a successful attack against Russia across the sea without the ability to ferry troops across the bay. It would also mean that the Swedes could only attack from one direction, Finland. The first clash between the navies of Sweden and Russia would take place off the island of Hogland on the 17th of July 1788. The Swedish squadron was made up of 15 ships of the line and 7 frigates. The Russian squadron was 17 ships of the line strong and also brought along 7 frigates. Among the Russian ships was the Rostislav, carrying 100 guns in total. The other warships either had 70 or 60 guns each. Between the two fleets, the battle was fought with a total of 2,416 cannons. The Swedish squadron was commanded officially by the king's younger brother, Duke Karl. Young, uneducated in matters of naval combat, and inexperienced, the true command of the fleet was in the hands of the very capable Commodore Otto Henrik Nordenskjöld, who would issue orders in the name of the king's brother. The battle commenced and would last for 6 hours. The Swedish crews would prove themselves superior shots with the cannons compared to their Russian counterparts, but not without issues that followed. Firing fast and competently, the Swedes were quickly running out of ammunition, but their accurate shelling was not for nothing, as it allowed the Swedes to make up for having not only fewer ships, but also smaller ships and fewer cannons in total. During the battle, the king's younger brother, Duke Karl, proved himself a brave leader in the heat of battle, for even if he let his commodore take charge of the battle itself, the Duke himself ran up and down the top deck despite incoming Russian cannonballs and encouraged his crew to keep fighting and to keep firing their deadly and effective broadsides. A notable story took place on the Swedish vessel Vasa, a ship of the line carrying 60 cannons in total. Both the captain and his second in command were mortally wounded, and command was handed over to a 23-year-old lieutenant, Per Gustav Lagerstråle. Before dying, Captain Horn grabbed the young lieutenant and told him, "You will answer to me before God should you strike your colors." Lagerstråle continued the battle successfully and would 4 days later be promoted to captain. The clash at Hogland continued for 6 hours until darkness fell. At this time the Swedes were almost out of ammunition. The Russians had lost 1,700 men, of which 600 were dead. The Swedes had lost 1,150, and of those, 300 had died. A huge portion of Swedish wounded and killed had served on the Swedish ship of the line Prince Gustav, a 70-gun warship that had been forced to surrender to the enemy after having used up all of its ammunition and taken several hundreds of hits to the hull, of which 32 had crucially struck along the waterline. The following day, both squadrons remained at the scene of the battle, but none could realistically continue the fighting. The Russians had taken too much damage and the Swedes had no ammunition left. Both sides had to withdraw to lick their wounds. Technically a draw between the two forces, but truth be told it was a Russian victory, since with the Swedish ships withdrawing, that meant that the Swedish army could not be transported across the sea to launch its ground campaign on Russian territory. The Russian commander at the battle, Admiral Grieg, later described the Swedish actions during the battle as nothing he had ever seen. The Swedes had been more eager and more aggressive, and had expertly controlled their ships and cannon fire. King Gustav III would write his younger brother and told him, "You have avenged the Swedish name and 60 years of disgrace." As fate would have it, the king could not continue his campaign against Russia as he had hoped. He could only attack from Finland by land, and the army was not happy with going on the offensive. On top of it all, Denmark now declared war on Sweden and invaded in the west. Gustav III would be forced to first deal with the Danes and then return to Finland to deal with Russian forces that by now had crossed the border. By August of 1789, a year later, the king was back in Finland and the Swedish navy accompanied their king. Having received news that the Russian fleet had been significantly reinforced, the Swedish king wanted to know what he was up against and ordered his navy to gather intelligence on the Russian navy. On the 15th of August, 1789, a squadron of 23 smaller ships from the Swedish archipelago fleet set sail to scout the Russian navy and its abilities. The archipelago fleet was not part of the actual Swedish navy. It was in fact a branch of the Swedish army at the time. The archipelago fleet was, as the name suggests, tailored to operate within the Swedish and Finnish archipelagos, and relied heavily on galleys and oars to navigate the thousands of islands and shallows of the Nordic coastlines. During the hours of dawn, the Swedes were discovered by the Russians in Summaviken, and battle commenced. The 23 Swedish vessels soon found themselves outnumbered by 107 Russian warships. Despite being severely outgunned, the Swedes kept fighting for 5 hours and were able to withdraw in the end without having taken too severe losses. The battle had convinced the Russians, however, that the Swedish navy had to be dealt with before it could become a threat to St. Petersburg. On the 24th of August, 1789, the Russian fleet found the Swedish vessels at Svenskund, off the island of Kotka, where the Swedish archipelago fleet was supporting the army as it was advancing towards the town of Fredrikshamn. The Russians attacked with their 107 vessels, while the Swedes only had 44 ships present. The Swedish admiral Ehrensvärd received news that the Russian fleet had split in two in a clear attempt to outmaneuver the smaller Swedish force and outflank it, catching the Swedes in a deadly crossfire. The main Russian squadron was moving in from Fredrikshamn from the north, navigating the narrow corridors of the archipelago. The second squadron, 20 to 30 ships strong, was coming in from the south. Ehrensvärd devised a plan to block off the larger Russian force by blocking the approach by purposefully scuttling some of his own vessels. Slowing down the main Russian force in this way would allow the Swedes to attack the smaller Russian squadron with full force. But the king himself was opposed to the plan. Blocking the passages would not serve him, as he needed his ships to follow him to Fredrikshamn, and his push towards the town would be slowed down if his ships had to bypass the blocked passages. In the end, with almost no time to spare, the king did agree to the plan to block off the main passages between the archipelago fleet and Fredrikshamn. But with little time to prepare, some passages could not be properly blocked off with scuttled vessels. The king himself took position on Kotka Island to watch the battle unfold. At 10 in the morning, the smaller Russian squadron approached from the south. They found themselves up against the main contingent of the Swedish force, and the Swedes had positioned themselves favorably. At the same time, the main Russian force was approaching from the northeast and found themselves slowed down by the half-sunken Swedish ships. The Russians sent smaller squadrons to try and find other passages through the archipelago, where they ran into Swedish ships waiting in ambush. The Russian squadron to the south, incredibly enough, managed to occupy the Swedes for 6 hours before falling back, but only after 3 of its vessels had been boarded and several others had been severely damaged, which gave the Russian main force time to fight their way through the narrow passages. The Swedish vessels that defended the sunken barrier found themselves outflanked and had no choice but to fall back. The Russians slowly navigated past the sunken debris, clearing a path so that they could push on through. As the Swedish fleet retreated, one vessel remained to delay the Russians, the frigate Oden. Paying tribute to the Viking god of war that it was named after, Oden fought on and fired every cannon shot it had carried with it before it eventually surrendered. Later at night, as the Russians took chase of the Swedish fleet, another Swedish frigate was forced to stand its ground as the Russians caught up with it after it had run aground in the dark of night. It was the frigate Björn Järnsida, named after a legendary Viking warrior, best known in English as Bjorn Ironside. The frigate Järnsida put up fierce resistance against overwhelming odds before eventually surrendering, in the end having lost not only its captain but the 3 following acting captains, along with almost all of its crew. When the long battle was over, late in the night, the Swedes had lost 17 warships and some 1,500 sailors. The Russians had lost only 2 ships and around 1,000 of its men. Almost a year later, in July of 1790, the Swedish Navy, together with the archipelago fleet, had tried to launch a sneak attack towards St. Petersburg. The attempt failed and ended with the Swedish vessels being trapped at Viborg, with their only escape blocked by 50 Russian ships of the line. In a daring escape that would become known as the Viborg Gauntlet, the Swedish fleet managed to punch through the powerful blockade and avoided certain doom. But not without cost. Some 30 ships and around 5,000 men had died as the Swedish fleet forced their way out of the deadly trap. The king gathered what was left of his fleet and linked up with other squadrons, once again at Svenskund. With the Russian fleet closing in, intent on finishing the job, many Swedish officers argued for a full retreat, but the king stood his ground. And he was supported by a lieutenant colonel, Karl Olof Kronstedt. Kronstedt had taken part in the first battle of Svenskund the year before, and knew the area well. He was confident that this was the right place to not only fight, but to also defeat the Russian Navy. On the morning of the 9th of July, the king appointed Kronstedt as commanding officer of the Swedish fleet. It was decided the Swedes would stand their ground once again at Svenskund. The Swedes knew that the Russians were closing in, scouting vessels continuously sending reports to the king and his officers, and that if the battle was to take place at Svenskund, it would be on the 9th of July. It was now or never. The Swedish fleet had arranged itself in the shape of a horseshoe, divided into 3 squadrons, with a 4th squadron in reserve, plus acting as rearguard. The Swedish fleet was 275 ships strong, carried 14,000 men, and brought 1,300 cannons. Shortly before 9:30 in the morning, the first Russian ships were sighted approaching the Swedish positions from the south, as expected. The Swedish scouts had done their job well. The Russians had brought 274 ships to Svenskund, many of which were larger and more powerful than the ships in the Swedish fleet, as well as 18,500 men, together with 1,800 cannons. 549 ships in total, 22,500 fighting men, and 3,100 cannons, of which half was considered to be heavy artillery, all forced into the narrow straits of the Finnish archipelago. How was this possible? Both the Swedes and the Russians had a proper navy that relied on large warships carrying 60 to 80 cannons, even as many as 100 cannons per ship. But such large vessels had trouble maneuvering between islands and relied too heavily on the wind to propel them forward. And waging war along the coasts of Finland as well as Sweden was not suited for such large and impressive vessels. The solution was to go in the complete opposite direction, with the creation of an archipelago fleet. A fleet especially designed to operate among islands in narrow straits in shallow water and close to the shoreline. A fleet that did not rely on the wind. Each archipelago fleet relied on hundreds of smaller vessels, like the gun sloop and gunboat, fast, nimble, and agile, and relying on oars to complement their smaller sails. These small warships could easily and quickly move around and reposition as needed among the thousands of islands of the Nordic archipelago. Bringing between 1 to a dozen guns each of various sizes, each of these vessels carried considerable punch, and when assembled in squadrons of a dozen or more, all of a sudden you could quickly amass the firepower usually found on the largest of battleships. And by being so small and spread out, as well as maneuverable thanks to their oars, they became extremely difficult to target by larger ships. These gun sloops and gunboats were, in essence, a precursor for the torpedo boats of our modern era, small, fast, and fully capable of harassing and sinking larger warships if used properly. Some Swedish vessels of the archipelago fleet were quite advanced for their day, and even had guns that could be moved back and forth on sleds along the boat to fire in the direction required. Like we mentioned before, the Swedish archipelago fleet was attached to the army. This meant that the officers of the archipelago fleet often were young men out to prove themselves as they strived for a career in the army ranks, seeking to join the fleet in search of adventure. As a consequence, the Swedish archipelago fleet was commanded by officers who were daring and eager to take risks in the heat of battle, making it a very aggressive and formidable opponent, despite being made up of only smaller ships with only a few guns per vessel. Shortly after 9:30 in the morning of the 9th of July 1790, the Russian and Swedish fleets opened fire on each other. The Second Battle of Svenskund had begun. The Swedish horseshoe was reinforced by artillery positioned on two smaller islands that linked up all three squadrons. As the Russians advanced, they came under heavy fire from every side. The Russian Navy made a strong push towards the Swedish right flank, with intent to break through and swing around and attack the Swedes in the rear. Swedish reinforcements of 30 ships arrived promptly from the reserves, and the Russian attempt failed. By 11 o'clock, the Swedish right flank managed to turn the situation on its head, and the bold and daring army officers of the archipelago fleet launched a counterattack into the Russian formations. The Russian fleet took heavy losses as the Swedes cut through them, and soon enough the Swedish right flank began firing on the Russian center. The Russians reinforced their left flank with ships from their rightmost formations. Eventually, the Swedes concluded that no Russian ships were coming at them from the rear. The decision was made to abandon the rear guard and to send in the reserves to bolster the battle. At 3 o'clock, several ships of the reserve were ordered to link up with the Swedish left flank. Lieutenant Colonel Hjelmstierna, who had command of the Swedish left flank, deployed half of his ships to perform a daring maneuver. At speed, they disengaged and headed south between the islands, relying on their oars for freedom of movement, and came up behind the Russian formations. The Russians began to deploy vessels to counter the Swedish flanking move, but as Russian vessels began to leave formation to face the Swedes behind them, other Russian captains, who were not aware that the fleet had been outflanked, thought that the Russian vessels moving south were actually retreating. Confusion spread as more and more Russian vessels began to withdraw from the battle, thinking it was lost. With the Russians outflanked on the Russian right, and with several vessels in retreat, it gave the Swedes the opportunity to push the advantage on the Russian left. And said and done, the Swedish ships forced the Russians to withdraw from the Russian left altogether. The remaining Russian ships were now trapped, almost encircled by the Swedish fleet. The warships located in the Swedish center were the heaviest of the Swedish fleet, and each salvo of their broadsides almost tipped them over, and they were now firing volley after volley into the tightly packed Russian fleet. The concentrated fire sank many of the most powerful Russian vessels. At 8 o'clock at night, the Russians officially called a retreat, but the fighting would continue until midnight. Some Russian vessels would try and escape in the cover of night, but they were hunted down by Swedish gunboats, harassed by the small, fast and deadly boats. The fighting was finally concluded at 9 o'clock on the 10th of July, almost 24 hours after the battle had begun. When it was all over, Russia had lost around 70 ships, and some sources claimed the number was even higher than 80. 4,000 men had been killed or wounded, and 6,000 had been captured. More than half of the Russian manpower killed, wounded, or captured. The Swedes also captured 22 Russian ships during the engagement, of which one was the Russian flagship, Katarina. Sweden had lost 6 vessels in total, with 170 men killed and 500 wounded. The astounding victory at Svenskund forced Russia to the negotiation table. While no territory swapped hands, Russia was forced to abandon all rights to interfere in Swedish politics, conditions that had been set after Sweden had lost the Great Northern War. Sweden was now once more a sovereign nation, free to conduct its domestic and international politics without Russian interference. Russia had no trouble accepting these terms as they were still involved in a war with the Turks in the south. It was a cheap price to pay to keep the Swedes away from St. Petersburg and allow the Russians to focus on the war with the Ottoman Empire. Worth pointing out are the three women who served and fought at the Second Battle of Svenskund. Britta Hagberg was a soldier who used the fake name of Petter Hagberg. Her true identity was revealed as she was being treated for her wounds. After battle, Lieutenant Commander Carl Olof Kronstedt himself made sure that Hagberg would receive her soldier's pension. Anna Maria Engsten had, during the Viborg Gauntlet, single-handedly steered a supply ship through Russian gunfire while the ship was sinking, managing to get it to safety with the rest of the Swedish fleet. For her actions, she was rewarded with 50 riksdaler by the king himself. Both Hagberg and Engsten would receive the medal Valor at Sea for their bravery. Dorothea Maria Lösch took command of the vessel Armida during the fierce battle at Svenskund, after all other officers had been killed. For her actions in the face of the enemy, she became the first woman of the Swedish Navy to be honored with the rank of captain, provided by King Gustav III. Warfare in the Baltic has for over 1,000 years relied on small, fast, and extremely deadly warships. During the Viking Age, Norse warriors would launch attacks across the sea in their technologically advanced longships. Expertly built gun sloops and gunboats would decide battles between Sweden and Russia during the Age of Empires. And during the Cold War, it was the torpedo and missile boats with jet engines that navigated the archipelago at incredible speeds, armed to the teeth with ship-sinking weapons. And today, the modern Swedish Navy relies on only a handful of super-advanced corvettes and patrol boats, but can field close to 300 smaller attack craft. Fast, agile, and deadly, capable of dropping sea mines, launching anti-ship missiles, and firing 50 cal machine guns, plus transporting large numbers of Marines and Coast Jaegers, who themselves bring with them anti-ship missiles to be launched from any one of 1,000 islands available along the Swedish coastline. Among these 300 attack craft, the Combat Boat 90 stands out, with Sweden having 165 in total. From the longships of the 8th and 9th century to the combat boats of the 21st century, the Baltic Sea has been dominated by Swedish warships that have been small, fast, and extremely deadly for their size. As the saying goes, it's not the size that counts, it's how you use it. If you are interested in how Sweden has handled itself in more recent conflicts, I have a couple of videos detailing this very subject. I suspect many of you have already seen my video Hold the Border, detailing events in 1981 when Sweden and the Soviet Union almost ended up in a war against each other. And it was only 400 meters and 30 seconds that separated peace from war in that incident. So if you're interested in a really dangerous Cold War situation, I highly recommend Hold the Border. And if you're interested in World War II, I have 2 videos detailing how Sweden took part in World War II. More specifically, in Finland's Winter War, Sweden did send soldiers, sent a third of its air force into Finland to fight the Soviet Union and help Finland. And you can watch that in Sweden's Winter War. And then you have the Grafström raid detailing a specific incident, specific mission during the Winter War when a company of Swedish Jaegers found themselves outnumbered 6-1 behind enemy lines, fighting off Soviet troops. And last but not least, Operation JDX-1 taking place during the Congo crisis in the early 60s. UN soldiers are sent into the deep jungle of the Congo to fight a communist cannibal rebellion. And many of those soldiers taking part in this very unique and special operation were Swedish soldiers. And I highly recommend that video. It is an insane story, and Swedish soldiers received medals and awards for their incredible courage fighting cannibals in the Congo. And obviously I will be providing links to all these videos down below, so if anything piqued your interest, take a look and you will find the link where you can watch the video. And that's the end of this video. I hope you found it interesting. I hope you will stick around for more videos, and if you're new to the channel, I hope I convinced you to subscribe. And yeah, not much else to say except that with everything going on in the world, Russia will remember that Swedish steel cuts deep. See ya.